Yeah, no, that's okay. Excuse the technical difficulties here. No, I'm real happy to talk to you, and I also first would like to say that I look forward to get to meet you. Some of you I met before, but I look forward to strengthen our relationship as the clubs is obviously what is Canoe Canada and our national team. So I'm really grateful for that relationship. I started in December and started working straight away with Graham. Came in late in the planning process, but have had a little bit of an impact. And the first real task has been, first of many, but the first real obvious one where we really get in contact with the athletes was the ski camps, where I went and visited almost all of them, and now we're in the on-water phase. We also did some site visits where we went to the training centers and in Nova Scotia and Quebec City. So I'm real happy with all the work that's been done there. And again, it will be my role to assist in the technical parts. If you put it simple, make sure that the training makes sense and that we make sure that we're marching in the right direction and improving our performance. And the biggest piece of that is the everyday excellence, and that's where I will try and be firm on. We can't just expect periods of excellence. More looking into, like I said, it's the Wednesday morning and the Thursday afternoon and everything in between that makes a big difference. And I truly believe that there is no magic in this sport and there's no shortcuts. But saying that, we need to be smart and use all the resources that we have available. And I look forward to this journey. And as I'm sitting here in a car in Florida, we've just started our first month of on-water training for the season. And I think our groups are looking well. And those athletes who are not in a centralized location training with the national team, most of them showed up in well prepared. So I would like to say thank you for preparing those athletes. And we're laying the foundation for the season to come. And it's no different from what you do in your clubs or what you've done many years. But we're trying to ensure that we take good care of your athletes and to make them the best they can be, actually trying to make them better than they self can realize. They're beyond their perceived expectation. So today, I hope we will meet and talk again, like I said initially. But today, we have prepared a presentation from the men's K4. It's to give some insight in how we work with pacing and racing, which I think is very important, because you will show up to a race with your given physical capacity, given mental capacity. But you got to squeeze out the most out of that on race day. And to me, it's really crucial that you distribute these powers evenly and that you can control the controllables. So I would like to hand over to Fred and Mike Powell. If you guys are ready to present, that would be very nice.
And
after this, we can open for questions also.
Yeah, I'll just say I think I would be good if we pass it to Mike and Fred for their presentation, but we'll leave time at the end for questions for Mike and Fred, but also for you, Anders. Just to we'll
yeah,
go.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So thank you.
Yeah, and remembering that this is a long relationship, so we will come back to the topics, and I love to keep talking about the training and how we move together, and it's a two-way street where we learn from each other. So I'm happy for this process. Thanks.
All right, thanks, and I'll over to you, Fred and Mike. Thanks, Anders.
Hey, do you hear us?
Yeah, we hear you perfectly. Great, that sounds great.
Perfect. So thanks for inviting us, Mike and I, again. That's a pleasure. And I see that some coaches were also at the summit in November. So I'm really excited and happy about that. It means to me that maybe it was so exciting, or maybe you guys didn't understand. So we're going to start. So you see the screen, yeah, everybody?
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah, it's good. Perfect.
So we're trying to close that window here. Okay, good. Okay, so what we want to talk, what we're gonna talk, we're gonna talk about the World Cup gap analysis. We're gonna go with the under 23 and senior World Gap analysis, race distribution, gap analysis tool, crew boat selection, and heart rate monitoring. So here's like after the World Cup, we went to 2 World Cup, one in Szeged and one in Bulgaria, not in Bulgaria, sorry, in Serbia. And so as you can see on the graph at World Cup 2, we finished 15 total, and that was a really strong World Cup. Some countries put 2 boats on the line. So like, of course, we were not happy to finish 15. But we knew that in the middle, like at the 250, we were like amongst the best crew. But at the end, we were like obviously dying. That's what we thought at this time, at that time. Sorry. So World Cup 3, we were a little bit better, but the World Cup were like not as strong, so not as deep. So 12th position again, like we felt the K4 as potential. But again, 12 was not something we were aiming better than that. So we were happy and sorry. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. So Mike just said like at World Cup 3, that's something you should notice. It's that Argentina beat us pretty easily actually. So that's important when you think about like the Olympic selection, and also important to compare like when we're gonna do our gap analysis at the end, like after World Championship at the end of the year. So as you can see on the right side of the page, like at the top, it's like World Cup 2, we were ranked 12, because if you take out, sorry, what did I mean? Yeah, if you take out Slovakia, sorry, Hungary, and Russia, because these countries were double, like there were two boats for each country, so we were 12, and like after Serbia, we were 10th. So after World Cup, we say, okay, like we're not in the final, but if you look at the time, we're gonna look at the time a little bit further. So when you look at the time, we knew we were not in the final, but we're not far as well. So okay, sorry, I forgot to tell you, if you look at the table here, like if you take the 2 World Cups, and can you explain that? It's too expensive.
Yeah, so the table right here is a combined ranking after both World Cups. So you could say that we were ranked 14th in the world after both World Cups because we had beaten all the other crews and we hadn't beaten these crews that were ahead of us. Yeah, so we really took a deep dive into the race distributions from the World Cups because we wanted to understand how do you race K4 500 optimally, and you got the stroke rate of the race and you got the velocity. on the right here, there's some key factors that we tend to look at. So things like the peak stroke rate of the boat, we hit 156. The peak velocity of the boat was 7.2 meters per second, okay? And then the first 250 split was 39.8 seconds, and the second 250 was 42.3 seconds. So we try to look at the differential between the two 250s to give us an indication of how we distributed energy over that race, and what we could do to kind of optimize for a better distribution. So you can see that our differential was 2.5 seconds, and actually in the semifinal it was 3 seconds, because the K4 went out like crazy, and we're leading the race for most of the race until the very end, where things crash down. And in this profile, you can see towards the end, the velocity tends to come down quite a bit. And that's where we were losing a lot of positions in that particular race.
Yeah, but okay, so I'm gonna add something. Like, as a coach in my position, when I looked at the race, of course I was happy. I said, the guys, like, at least they're like right there until the 400. So it's like, we only have 100 meters like to work on, but like we figure out after all these analyses that it's maybe not the way to go. Like, it's more complicated than saying like, just like train harder and the last 100 that you're gonna hold on that last 100 and you're gonna be within the top 3 guys. But I think it's more complicated that after all this analysis we did. And like when we did that first race profiles, we didn't really understand how the K4 needs to be raced on 500. 1,000, I think everybody knows because all these years, but 500, it's a new Olympic event. So it was like our first race, international race, we can analyze.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point, because it's kind of a blank slate with K4 500, and I think we were just trying to not make any assumptions. We're trying to not say we know exactly what we're doing. We need to observe. We need some data to kind of prove it. And so this was the Serbia final in Belgrade, the B final. You can kind of look at those same key factors. I believe it was maybe a bit less of a favorable wind in Belgrade, so the peak velocity was lower, 6.9. First 250 was 40.7, second 250, 43. So we're looking at a very similar differential of 2.5 seconds. And again, in the semifinal, the differential was much bigger. You can see again towards the end, the velocity line crosses the stroke rate line, which is really a loss of stroke distance and a loss of technical efficiency in the crew. So we were coming out of World Cups with 2 relatively similar distributions, and we were asking ourselves the question, well, what exactly should we be aiming for? How should we approach this?
And again, I'm going to add too also that like we were able to follow the race. And again, Belgrade was the same thing. Like the guys in the middle, like at the 250, they looked awesome, comfortable. It's about they're going to win, or they're going to be within the top 3. But always the same thing happening at the end. Like we were losing a lot of ranks. So that's what after, like, let me see the other. Okay. So after World Cup, like we all sit together with the athletes, with Mike, and we said like, okay, there's only 2 months in front of us. We don't think at this time, this is not where the guys are gonna be like more fitter, like in 2 months. So what's the easiest way, the shorter way to improve? We said, let's work on our race profile, because things like we're really good. We're really good in the middle, but we don't finish the race well. And we don't have much time in front of us to work on our speed endurance. So let's try to distribute to have a better race distribution.
Yeah, exactly. And so at U23 Worlds, the crew was different, and it seemed like they naturally self-selected a lower stroke rate, but a bigger gear. And
but we talked about it.
Yeah, we talked about it. We talked about it before, and those athletes executed a race where they had a bigger gear. And so if you look at the stroke rate relative to the velocity, there's a much bigger gap, which is an indication of stroke distance. And that maintains a lot better throughout the race. And in this race, the peak velocity was 6.9, so it was a bit lower. But the first 250 was still pretty quick. But the big differential here was the second 250 was less than 1 second differential, so it was a 40.8, which means that this crew was really maintaining their velocity pretty well relative to what our World Cup crew was doing.
Yeah.
So this gave us some a bit of support for this type of strategy, but we still weren't exactly sure what the optimal was at this point.
And just so make sure you guys remember, like we finished fourth at this competition, but we finished fourth like 0.1 from the winner. So the first 4 crew were like within 0.1 of second. And also we had to, like Marshall Hughes was sick in the morning, so we had to put somebody else, another Alex Scott, who never paddled in the K4. But that was pretty like a really good performance. And again, I think the race profile has something to do with that good performance.
And so now we're at Senior Worlds, and we have this, you know, it's the similar K4 as we had at World Cups. And you know, we performed in the semifinal, and as you can see on the race distribution here.
Yeah, just sorry, Mike. So all like between like all summer we work on our race plan. So we went to Senior Worlds, and when you look at these at this graph, you think, wow, like they didn't really work on the race profile. But this is my fault. The semifinal after the heat, we looked at data because now we have access to the data from the other countries, and I said, like, guys, you have a lower stroke rate than everybody else, so and you're not the fastest. Let's try to increase your stroke rate. So I told them the morning of the semifinal. That's what I told them. So this is what they execute the plan well, but
it was the wrong plan.
That was the wrong plan. Yeah, exactly.
And you can see, obviously, they did increase their stroke rate. They hit a peak of almost 170, much higher peak velocity as well, 7.3, and their first 250 was really quick. But they really paid the price for that in the second 250. So, you know, it's a really fine line between finding the optimal gear, which means, you know, what your traveling stroke rate is, and going too hard in the first 250. So immediately after the semifinals, I think we had a realization that, you know, that fine line exists, and we need to continue to find it. And we had a really good conversation with the guys right after the semifinal and before their final about, you know, trying to find that big gear that would sustain them for the full 500. And as you guys can see in this graph, they really nailed it in that race, which is a testament to how prepared they were to be able to change when things mattered, when things counted, to be able to execute, you know, a race plan like this. So you know, you can see if you look at the key details again, peak velocity was a little bit lower, 7.1, but it didn't really affect their first 250. Their first 250 was slightly slower, let's say. But you can see that the stroke distance that they've used is bigger than in the semifinal, and where that makes a difference is in the second 250. You can see that again, the split difference in the second 250 was much lower, under 1 second. Again, very similar to U23 World. So they found that sweet spot in race distribution and finding the perfect gear for this race. And in terms of times, it was their fastest race of the year, and they ended up winning the B final, which ranks them 10th overall. So in effect, this did have an improvement on their level of performance simply by changing how they approached the race.
Because if you remember, after World Cup, they were ranked 14th, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, okay. Cool.
Yeah, so this, what we have here is the race distributions of the various countries for the A final and the B final. In the top is the A final, and the top 9 is the B final. And you can see the split differentials. And Germany had a 1.8 split differential. Spain 3.2, massive split differential. They really gunned for it and fell apart big time. But you can see there's a bit of a trend here. The top 5 or 6 tend to be under 1 second or under 2 seconds in terms of a split distribution in the A and the B final. And then the bottom 4 or 5 ranks tend to be over 2 seconds. And so, you know, to us, this tends to indicate that finding the right distribution for your race leads to better race outcomes. Now, the question would be for Spain, a country like Spain, if they distributed it a little bit more effectively, would they have been able to beat the Germans because they weren't that far off? So, you know, if I was the Spanish, that's definitely be something I'd try out, but I wouldn't try to tell them that.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I go ahead. It's easier for you to explain.
Yeah, so there's a lot of information on this graph, and it's trying to communicate a lot of things. I'll try to break it down as simply as possible, but if we look at these blue bars, that's the stroke distance for each one of these races, right? So World Cup 2 final, World Cup 3, U23, Senior World semifinal, and World's B final.
But the number, like, 6, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so if you look at the stroke distances, you can see that the U23 A4 had the biggest stroke distance. This is at the 150 into the race, so relatively at their travel pace. And the World's crew is not too far behind. In the yellow, this is the split differential, so the difference between the first and the second 250. So if you look up here, you can see.
You should tell like that. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. You can see when the split differential is high, the stroke distance tends to be much lower, right? And when the split differential is low, the stroke distance tends to be higher. So, you know, this support the idea that stroke distance is related to, and you can also see the times here. So this is the final time. I believe these are corrected times. But it also tells you that the stroke distance is somewhat related to the final time. And our best final time was at Worlds in the B final, finding the best balance between all those different factors.
Just to reinforce our idea about race profile, and that's something we, as a coach, like I'm sure like all the coaches knows, and I knew, but sometimes you just need like really good example to really believe it, to buy in it. And after the K4, like we like that race profile thing, like we really start to work on this when we start to work with Emily in 2016, and that's something like it's really hard for a coach to accept, because we always like, I know like sometimes we feel good about our athletes being like within the top 3 of the 400, and when they finish like 8, we'd say, yeah, but my athletes were still like in the top, like at the 400, but it's not the reality. The reality is the ranking at the end. And it's easy to tell our athletes like, okay, we're going to train harder next year, so you're going to be able to sustain the last 100 meters, but it's not always true. Sometimes it's just a matter of race distribution. So sometimes it's just like, it's not the reality when we look at the race like this, and it's really important to have like an optimal race profile or race distribution. So like when we start to work with Emily, like in 2016, we only worked with her like a few months. That's something like, because like seeing Emily race all these years, like that's something like, I think at the 250, she was like almost leading all the races, but she couldn't sustain the second part. And we all know Emily had a really good cardio, good aerobic capacity. So it's something's wrong with her race profile for sure. So it took a lot of work. So that's an example, like at the trials one in Georgia last year, sorry, for the Olympic trials in 2016. Like we made a plan, worked on the plan for 3 months. Like she knew what she had to do, but the first race she went there, maybe it's the stress, maybe she'll forget, but this is how she raced. So as you can see, like the stroke, the rate is there's no stroke distance. The blue line is at the top of the red lane, right? So there's no efficiency at all. So there's no pacing, no gear. So that was also not a good performance from Emily. Right?
Yeah, this is actually one of the best case studies we could possibly have ever asked for in terms of race distributions, because this is happening live. This was happening in the same day over 2 days, and there was an opportunity to make adjustments and see what the effects would be on not only the time but the ranking as well, because the first final at Trials 1 that year, her ranking was 3rd in this particular race, and you can see the distribution there.
So just so I'm sure you understand that within the same weekend, like the athletes, our athletes cannot change if they're good, like their shape, like their fitness. Okay, so it has to, like, the performance change with something else. So if you look at final 2 now, you see like it's much better, like the stroke rate, so it's below the red line, not all the way, but like much better in the race, the first one, and she won that race, and you could see it's a nice pace.
Yeah, this was exactly what was practiced and what we were trying to reinforce, and I think the feedback was, well, that felt really easy. And in fact, for the first 250 anyway, the last 250 is really difficult, but the result was drastically different in this situation. And so we have a direct contrast with 2 very different race profiles. If you contrast them like that, you can see there's a huge difference, right? It's more evenly distributed. You're saving some energy for the end, and you're utilizing a bigger gear. So these concepts are really jumping out at us as we're doing more work with these race profiles. And then in the 3rd final,
it's even better.
It was even better, and yeah, again, the stroke distance was better, and the distribution was better, and it led to a better finish. And I mean, again, every athlete in every race will have the ideal gear for that athlete, right? What stroke distance should they use to get the optimal outcome? And you need to have a little bit of trial and error with that, but for sure, if the athlete's spinning or trying to go way too hard at the first 250, it's going to be hard to have the best outcome with that.
And you can see also, like, the race 1, the peak stroke rate. Sometimes just the beginning of the race is gonna set up your race entirely. So like race 1, she peaked at 160 stroke per minute. In the 3rd race, she peaked at under 140. So it's a big difference. And you see the race profile after that. So that's something else. We think like the peak stroke rate at the beginning of the race is really important. If you peak too high, you cannot change the gear after. It's too late. So you need to select the right gear right at the beginning.
You set up the race in the first 50 to 100 meters, and if you stroke too high, you're going to get into a spinning mode. So really finding a good overspeed at the starts and then a good transition into a big gear is really the critical factors to figuring out the optimal race profile for an athlete. Exactly what we just kind of said, just summarizing that. So that, the factors that we really try to examine, we're looking at the peak stroke rate at the start, making sure it's not too high or too low, which could be a factor for other athletes. Look at stroke distance at transition, and that's what we refer to as gear. What stroke rate do you settle into for the majority of your race relative to your velocity? That's going to really indicate how effective or efficient you can be for the entire race. And then we also look at the split difference, right? So if you have a massive split difference, it's an indication that something isn't optimal in your race profile. If it's 4 seconds or 5 seconds or 6 seconds, it can be way too big. You want to have, in a 500 especially, you want to have something closer to 2 or 3 seconds is probably optimal.
Now we're going to talk about like how we are doing our gap analysis of each of the athletes, and also like just to show you how it's helping us, the coaches, to select our crew boat as example. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so we looked at the gap analysis for the race profile, and we kind of identified some factors to look at. But after World Championships, what we wanted to do is look at our gap analysis for the building blocks of performance, or the physiology of the athletes and what they needed to improve. And we identified a couple key areas. And so what you're seeing now is just where each athlete is distributed in these key areas. And we've identified velocity at lactate 3 and velocity at lactate 7 as the aerobic markers that need to be improved. And you can see a hierarchy of where the guys are. We've put in a gold medal standard for each one of these that we want to see progression towards. And then on the other side, we're looking at 5-second velocity, which is a measure of acceleration in the athletes, and maximum speed, which is an indication of how fast the athletes are, mainly over 200. And distance per stroke, right? We want athletes that can paddle with big gears, because ultimately those are going to be the athletes that are the best in crew boats. Now, for K4 500, sometimes you get the question like, well, why is top speed important? Why do we even care about top speed? And well, what we found was that if you look at the velocities in the different events, and this is what this graph is showing, there's something really unique about K4 500. So at the very bottom, the slowest event is K1000. So those athletes tend to be more aerobically dominant. They're better in VLA 3 and VLA 7. They're maybe a little slower. They don't need the speed of a 200-meter athlete, and they can't produce the speed of a 200-meter athlete. And the K1 500 is a little bit faster than the K1000. But then you look at the K1 200, and the top speed requirements are significantly higher than the K1 500. You look at the K4 500, it's even way higher than the K1 200, right? They're hitting top speeds of 7.5 meters per second. This is crazy fast. The water is moving at a really, really high pace. And so what we found was that if you put an athlete that's really slow, or that has a difficulty following fast moving water, which is, you know, if you're fast, you have a tendency to be able to follow really fast water, then you're more than likely going to struggle from a technical perspective in K4 500. And so the 200 gives us more of an indication of the technical requirements of being able to paddle in a K4 500, and that's why we want to maximize that quality. This is the physiological. So on the flip side, though, if you look at K1000, you know, it's the longest event, of course, it needs the most endurance. And K1000 is 2.1 times a K1 500. So on the spectrum of energy and endurance, K4 500 is a lot closer to K1 500 than the other events, right? It's obviously more than double K1 200, and it's less than a K1000. So from a physiological perspective, you want your athletes to be as fit as possible over K1 500, right? Even though it's a little bit shorter than what a K1 500 would be. But you want them to have the technical ability to paddle quickly like a K1 200-meter athlete.
So basically, you need to be able to connect even in K4. Some athletes, we know, because as you said, the boat is moving too fast, not too fast, yet too fast for them. They cannot apply the same strength, the same force on their paddle because it's too quick, so they have no connection. That's why we like to also like our athletes to have like a good top speed in the K4. So like a proof for us that they can paddle well in the K4, like that's moving fast.
Yeah, and as we, you know, so far we've seen that this tends to hold true when we try different crew combinations. It's a pretty big law.
So now we're going to talk about also gap analysis, because Graham a couple of months ago for that OTP submission asked all the coaches to find a way to present like easy to read, easy to see like the gap analysis of each of our athletes. And he sent us also a few examples from different sports, what tool they're using. And I think, Graham, what you sent about tennis, that's what was talking to me the most. So that's why we started using, like, we personalize it for us. So we're using like a spider graph, and I think it's easy for me. It's easy for the IST and for the athlete and their personal coaches to understand what the athletes needs to improve. Like really a quick glance of it, and you really have a good idea like what profile the athletes has.
Yeah, so you know, these are the same indicators that we mentioned before that we're looking at, and with these spider graphs, you can tell where the athletes distributed, and for each event, you're going to have a specific distribution that's optimal for that event. So if you think about a 1,000-meter athlete, you probably want their spider graph to be very full in the VLA3 and VLA7. Those are very important. In a 200-meter athlete, you want max speed and acceleration to be the highest, right? Those are the most important ones. And so K4 and K2000, we're looking for certain distributions, and we're trying to train towards those types of distributions for those athletes to fit them into the optimal profile for that event.
Okay, so this is what I asked Mike. I said, okay, it's good to have like a graph for each of our athletes, but also it would be good to see what we're looking for. What's the optimal, what optimal KPI the athletes were looking for like the best K4 in the world. So that's why.
Yeah, so we've got, you know, this is currently where our athletes are in terms of
in yellow, in orange
ability, yeah, in orange. And you can see they tended towards being better at the 500 and max speed and pretty good paddlers from a distance per stroke perspective, but relatively weaker in velocity at lactate 3 and velocity at lactate 7. And so that identified the gap of where we needed to train, which was basically to boost aerobic capacity this particular year. But at the same time, we still need to see improvements in 500 max speed and acceleration. So, but it just tells you how much further away we are in different areas here. And so with the exact same logic in mind, this is the same thing for K2000. So, you know, currently we're lacking even more in velocity of lactate 3, velocity of lactate 7 for the ideal K2000 athlete. So we need to get them much fitter to be anywhere near competitive in K2000. And I think that was pretty obvious when we competed in at World Cups in our K2000 results.
Okay, so that's Mike and I sat like last fall, and at the end of the year, and I said, let's Mike, look, Mike, like nobody is centralized yet, and like I'd like to know what's going on where they're not on the center. Not only that, to even like the athletes I'm working with every day, I'd like to have a better idea what's going on when they train, like, because I'm a super maniac to make sure like if my athletes respect the intensity of my workout. So now we have we have that heart rate monitor. So it's like it exists for a long time now. So I said, let's using it. Let's try to collect more data. Let's try to figure out if these guys were training in the right zone after the full cycle. So that's what Mike started to do. Like it.
Yes, we're using programs like Polar Flow and Garmin Connect, and the athletes are recording their heart rates. And at this particular time, this was during the winter and the fall, where athletes weren't centralized. So Fred wanted an easy way to be able to check in to say, number one, are you doing the work necessary to get better? So are you following the program that he's sending out? Are you doing enough volume? Whatever. And then answer the second question, which is, are you doing the work properly, right? So if you spend most of your time at too high of an intensity when you're trying to work on low intensity work, you're not going to develop that zone. So this became a tool to be able to monitor the athletes and specifically try to address that gap on VLA3, VLA7 to push that up some more. And this was one of those solutions.
Yeah, there's no much to say about it. It's just an example of like, because I have we have all their passwords, so we can go directly to their account. And talk about it.
Just talk about what's going on now.
Yeah, so like last fall, we started to do some testing. We already doing the step test on the water, but I always have a hard time with the step test because the conditions are always changing, the water temperature, the wind. So we decided to go in a lab. So to do like, I know some other countries are already doing this in it for a long time. So we go at the INS in Montreal and we're using the herbs. And so we calculate all different factors like KPI. So we just to try to understand how the athletes are performing. As you can see here, like we can calculate the wind gate test is we can see who is sprinters or not, the VO2 max. We can find the training zone and movement economy and the muscle oxygenation and the data from the VO2 max. So as you can see here, like it's but Jan, do you think we should go too much in the details like this? Or?
I think you're at a good level right now. Yeah, you can keep doing as you're doing. It's fine.
Okay, good. So as you can see here, the max power, again, that test is the data from the wind gate. Okay, so it's a 30-second all out. So as you can see, this is the max power. So this is the total work the athletes developed. The mean power, it's the average during the 30 seconds. The max power per weight is the relative to their body weight. The mean power weight, so you can see. So if you see it, like the red is the athletes I'm looking for. So the athletes can look, all the blue, all the other athletes who did the test, and the red is the athletes who's looking at his data. So he can compare himself to the rest of the group. Okay? So as you can see, this athlete has a really high max power and mean power, but relative to his body weight, it's not as good. But the thing we know that in kayak, body weight doesn't influence as much as like when you run. So it's not, I prefer to look at the absolute data than the relative data. Here's the VO2 max. So the athletes we're looking at right now at the highest VO2 max relative to his body weight and absolute. I don't know if you guys know, but 6 liters per minute, that's a big VO2 max. But the problem, if you look with a big VO2, that athlete has a really high VO2 max, but the PAM, so in watts, so the total works done, it's really low. I don't know if you are going to follow me. So even relative to his body weight, so with a good VO2 max, he doesn't really use it. He doesn't produce a lot of energy. So that's a problem of efficiency. Here's the lactate too. Okay, that's the lactate max was really low. Yeah, so after the test, like the physiologist can tell us like the aerobic training zone. But if we're gonna use it, because erg test inside is not like a test on the water. But last week we did a test on the water, a VO2 max on the water with a portable max, VO2 max mask. So we're gonna be able to compare if the erg, inside erg, is related to what's going on in the water. So here, like it's in French, so this is the efficiency, but again, it's the efficiency on the ergs. So it's not really like something I'm looking at. So that's something else. It's really interesting. At the last week when we did the test on the water, also they're using a new equipment. It's called a Moxie, and they put the Moxie on 3 different zones in your body: on the bicep, on the lat, and on the leg. So it's to calculate how much oxygen your how much how can I explain that? How much, it's difficult in English. What's it's the can you explain that? It's how much oxygen your efficient.
Yeah, it's how much oxygen's in your muscles. So it just gives you an idea of how efficient your muscles are at utilizing oxygen that your blood is providing.
Yeah, and also it could be also that the athlete is not using that muscle. So let's say we take the leg. So if there's a greater desoxygenation, how do you say that? Desoxygenation? Yeah. So it means like maybe it's because he's using the legs, or maybe he's really efficient at the physiological level. So he's able to take all the oxygen that goes to his muscle. So he's really well equipped with the mitochondria and all that stuff. So it's really efficient, but it also tells us if technically he's using his legs or not.
Yeah, just to dive into a bit of the physiology here, if you have more mitochondria in the muscle, which is what you try to develop with GA1, you're going to get higher oxygenation of that muscle because your mitochondria will be able to utilize more oxygen from the blood, whereas aerobic power tends to work more the blood delivery system and your cardiovascular system to be able to extract blood from or oxygen from the air and deliver it to the muscle. So there's really two areas of main focus here.
That's it.
Fred, do you want to comment at all about what is going on right now?
That's what
You want to talk about how things are going this season?
No, not yet.
Okay, too soon for that.
Maybe you're better than me to explain, but I don't know what to.
No, I agree. Okay, well, we'll take any questions if anybody has any.
I think the question you ask, how we're doing right now, would be crucial. for the.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
So, Jerome, what was your question, just again?
Well, I'm saying that was a great question. Is where we are right now. What you guys have those athletes, so you should kind of have anticipation where you are, either you're excited or not. So the new athletes at least know what they should be coming, what to do.
I'm not good to like an open question. I need a specific question. Like again, things are going well. We test, like we did a training camp in Quebec City, cross country training camp, and the guys train really.
I'm not talking about the targets that you just show us. So are we getting close to those targets that you think that we can reach? What about, have a nice day in Quebec City with the wine and nice skiing, but talking about are we close to those targets?
But the answer, Jérôme, is we don't have, and right now we start to collecting data this week. Okay. So the first 3 weeks we didn't collect, we didn't collect data. Now we're starting collecting data on the athletes. So after this cycle, I'm gonna be in a better position to tell you if it's true or not.
Oh, what I'm saying is because once you do that, then you kind of feel comfortable about some of the data. Because if we're not there, what you think you want to be, then we need to start looking for new talents, and we can't be sticking what we have. Yes.
No, I agree. I agree with you.
But we have to start opening the doors and say, you know what, there might be a kid, a midget or something, or juvie that might be coming. Let's invest time. Maybe we can get them in 2 years. So we can qualify to Olympic Games. We can't be sticking with the same. We're not even saying that those athletes are still good, and then they keep setting standards, but we need to start bringing new ones faster, so we can.
But we can have another webinar in 3 weeks, and I'm going to be in better position to tell you where we are.
Okay, super.
That, again, it's just my feeling. It's going well, but I don't like to talk about my feeling. It's I prefer to use data because it's easy to convince ourselves things are going well. But again, like I prefer to use data like to show if we improve or not.
But it's just Ian here. I think what's really good is if we're able to share those spider graphs that you developed, and we have numbers that we're talking about, it helps anchor that discussion a lot better. Like, are we actually getting closer or are we not? So I think it's not a bad suggestion, like to check in and just generally as we go with just with the community. I agree, Jerome, like just so we understand, how we feel about those numbers, or if they're shifting, why they're shifting.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. Well, what I'm also potentially looking at, we do have now lots of great coaches that used to coach or retire, and it could be helpful for us. Maybe we should start thinking about plan B also, yes? So creating something like you guys have the top athletes, and then maybe a B team, which is also training as hard and similar structure. So those guys on the top are not fulfilling the needs. Then we have someone who can jump in right away instead of restarting with a brand new group, yes? You guys mean what I mean or no?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's interesting. For sure.
You know what I mean? Like, you can have 2 training camps, one is self-pay or whatever we structure, going in the same kind of a program, and then the new ones can actually potentially move it up fast, or at least if anything else, they make a pressure on the first group, yes? So we're not in a position that 1 or 2 guys get injured or not even reaching the targets and we have nobody. What's the key for with 2 guys, yes? You know, we need...
Hi, Jerome. Hi, Jerome. This is Anders.
Yeah.
I understand. I hope I understand your question.
Okay.
To me, it's important. Like, you're right. You need to look forward and make sure that we have the next guys or girls in line.
Right.
I look at my job is to look after the current top, and but it will also fall on the clubs to develop the next wave, if you like. So we have a shared responsibility there, in my view, and we're putting. You put a lot of trust in us, and we put a lot of trust in you to make sure that those next waves, before we sort of get our eyes really on them, they're in your care, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. No, I'm just looking at what's that new athlete or the club athlete. How can he get to the group? Yes, like what is the next step for him besides just a trial and nothing else? Like I'm just looking where they have the opportunity to actually show their talents or potentials, so you can actually have a look at them. Yes, I know you're busy with the top, and that's what you should be doing. And but I'm just looking for what's an opportunity for other ones to come in, or those little clubs or individuals to join that group, or even have a chance to show their talent.
I think, Jerome, the issue that we run into is capacity. But certainly in terms of what we tried to do in this last year, and what we'll continue to try to do, is to incorporate that next tier of athletes. And when we're talking next tier, we're talking about people that have demonstrated potential at a younger age, like U23 athletes, possibly someone that's coming out of junior, and incorporate them into training camps. Last year, we took the U23 group and incorporated them in training camps throughout the summer, and we would like to see that continue going forward. Going much deeper than that, it then becomes a case of capacity, and so we don't want to just focus on the seniors. We want to make sure that we're looking at another level. So that kind of answers you partly. Not sure how far we can get down below that.
Okay, I'm more looking for the system, but that's okay. No, maybe that's a start of it. Okay.
Thanks, Jerome. Any other questions for Anders or Mike and Fred?
Okay, we're done.
No, Blake has a question.
What are you saying? I can always ask the same question I asked at the conference in terms of how do we bring this down to the club level? What can club coaches do to monitor all this so that they're effective once they reach the senior level?
Raise profile, Blake. Raise profile.
Perfect. Thanks, Fred. Anything else?
With the race profile, like you teach them also that technique is super important. Like it's not necessarily the high stroke rate, but it's more than just the distribution. I think when we're talking about the race profile, it's also we need to go deeper in talking about like the stroke distance, how important it is. So I think for me it was like a discovery to dig into it like really deeply, because for me it's everything almost.
Yeah. Okay, I had a question here, and maybe Mike, you can help with it. It's from Sam Reich from Lachine. Have you compared validity of other GPS units to the spin unit? Is there an affordable model you would recommend?
That's a really good question. So I've compared our spin units to GPS watches. watches tend to be a lot less consistent. Maybe that's a bad word, but the collection frequency is pretty low on a GPS watch. You get about 1 hertz collection rate, and the spin units are 5 hertz on GPS, and we have 200 hertz accelerometer on that. I have been looking recently for a new unit to use because spin units are no longer in production, and we're in talks with a couple of different companies to produce a new unit. I think at the club level, if you're looking to get good feedback for athletes, a GPS watch is quite good, and you can get good pacing information off of it. Especially if you download the files onto your computer, you get a little bit more, obviously more detailed than just looking at your watch from second to second. So I think, and those tend to be a lot more affordable, than a full-out spin unit or a similar unit with really robust sensor capabilities. So yeah, I would definitely recommend like a good Polar watch or a good Garmin watch, and you can do a whole lot with that. Especially you can quantify, the athlete's effectiveness by looking at their travel velocity and looking at their heart rate at the same time. So what heart rate is getting into a little bit of physiology there. Now, obviously what you're missing is a stroke rate count or a stroke distance count. And as far as I know right now, spin units are pretty much the only thing that has an algorithm to calculate stroke rate. Not that it's a complicated thing to develop, it's just that a company needs to specifically develop one for kayaking and invest a couple of dollars into that. And that requires an accelerometer to be able to look at, when the boat surges up and down. So basically my answer to this question is use a GPS watch, like a heart rate monitor watch, get a pretty decent quality one, and you'll be able to look at pacing. You could look, if you count strokes for a piece, you can start to look at stroke distance, you can look at heart rate for that athlete, and I think that gives you a lot of really great information.
One thing that we've talked about, this is Ian speaking, is as we identify and solidify at the senior national team level the key energy systems and characteristics we're looking at ways that we can work back earlier in chronological development and scale some of the monitoring that we're doing with more high technology at the senior level to stuff that translates and gives pretty good data at the lower level. And Mike and I have talked about that, and tying some of that recommendation in with some of those recommended outcomes that we're looking for. An example of that would be looking at standardizing counting strokes over a certain number of distance for a stroke efficiency, stroke distance test that would be easier for coaches to do without technology, but could start that conversation and start some of that data. I know, Mike, you and I talked about that briefly, but just as a way that we could start athletes thinking about these concepts without requiring a lot of technological investment.
Yeah, there's a couple of basic things like you were saying, and I think it's just, first of all, it's like, let's start speaking the same language and talking about zones, and there's, you can go even simpler. You can do things with RPE and just starting to create a discussion about, how hard different sessions should feel, and that's a pretty good indicator and monitoring tool for different sessions. And then, yeah, it's just building up a good common language and then sharing information to unite it all together. So, but I think we're making some strides together, like you were saying, Ian. So I'm excited about those.
Are there any other questions for Anders or for Fred and Mike before we sign off? Here's a question. So Kiefer asked, are you going to be setting a framework or goals for different level age groups of athletes similar to your gold medal standards? For example, where a new U19 athlete should be at VLA3 or VLA7, etc.
So I think ideally yes, but I don't know if we know exactly what those levels are yet. So I think the framework needs to be let's speak the same language and look at these things, and then maybe over time we'll be able to set these standards for lower levels.
So yeah, I can speak to that a little bit, Kiefer, just in my discussions, and Graham can too. We've had a bunch of discussion about this, and as we create, like, one of my favorite slides in the presentation of Fred and Mike is the ideal or the desired athlete. I like having that on the spider chart and that declaration that this is the athlete we're looking for. But you're right, Kiefer, that naturally begs, as an athlete chronologically is younger, what are we looking for to get there? And what I think I'd like to do is take this reporting structure, the different categories that we've named, the VLA3, VLA7, the different categories, and try to start with estimations of where we think people should be and work on it together to establish them. I think we can fall in a trap of trying to perfect things first, get everything totally dialed in, when really it's going to be a work in progress. But I think for me, the important step that I'm trying to coordinate or look to coordinate is naming what we want to look at, what we want to talk about and measure with different athletes, and then work together. Because if Mike and Fred don't see the athletes at those lower levels, we don't have the access to that data and the day-to-day expertise that other coaches at different levels do. So it's a project I want to work on together, but my approach I want to have is to go for it, try to make some estimations, and then acknowledge that over time they're gonna move around.
Hey, Ian, Fred and I actually have to take off, but I want to just thank you guys for having us present this again. Hopefully we'll keep you guys in touch with all of our latest thinkings and data as we go along, and yeah, I look forward to interacting with the coaches anytime we see each other.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We're going to be posting this presentation for review and for other coaches that couldn't join to learn, have an opportunity to watch the presentation. I want to thank Blake Dalton. He really helped with the suggestion to have this educational opportunity. So thank you, Blake, and your coaches technical committee. I think it's a great opportunity. And thanks, Anders and Mike and Fred. So with that,
it's a pleasure, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Great. So with that, we'll sign off. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day across the country.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.